Welcome. It's Wednesday, February 22nd, 2012. I'm Aaron Dykes, and we are in an aggressive but entirely nonviolent information war. They are taking over our Constitution, hijacking the fact that we are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights, and we better take it back. This fascism has been creeping and creeping and creeping for decades. That's gone. It's happening now. Everything is coming undone, and the fight is on right now for our rights on every front imaginable. Coming up on one of those fronts, we have Sheriff Richard Mack. He's been doing constitutional conventions with sheriffs to try to take back our states and local counties from all this federal encroachment. That's coming up. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss it. But first, the news. Ron Paul is being cheated out of the Republican nomination, and don't be surprised out there. You've seen all the fudging on the media where they forget to even put his name in polls, where he comes in first or second place in a straw poll and they don't even report. They report on the third or fourth place people. All these other shark teeth, phony rhino candidates have fallen out of the race, and they still prop up Romney and Gingrich and Santorum. It still doesn't stop Ron Paul, even as they've been cheating him in primary and caucus state after caucus state after caucus state. We've got a video in just a moment with Alex on the issue in depth. But of course, they've had to admit in Maine they didn't count on the votes. They accidentally reported that they weren't going to count the votes in certain counties that would have swung towards Ron Paul. And most significantly, they put off a heavily pro-Ron Paul county and district for over a week due to snow that never came. Also, they can announce Mitt Romney as the winner. It happened in Iowa, too. They admitted they didn't have a real vote count, but they just agreed. The Republican Party agreed behind closed doors to announce Romney, then later Santorum, as the victor, giving them a too close for statistical tie count, only a few votes apart somehow. And Ron Paul magically, forgettably, in third place, even though he had nearly as many votes as well. And most suspiciously of all, Nevada, a heavily libertarian state, a leave me alone and get out of my life state that Ron Paul did very well in and came in second place in 2008. Yet in 2012, Ron Paul got barely any more votes and was nowhere to be seen as Mitt Romney somehow quote-unquote swept it. No, these are all signs of fraud. It's been taken from Ron Paul. The system is scared, and but he's not out of the race yet. Things can still happen. Anyway, let's go to Alex Jones now and see his in-depth coverage on this issue.
There's no doubt that there's election fraud going on in this country. There's been countless examples of it going back to Kennedy in 1960 and the fraud up in Illinois. We know about LBJ in Texas to get into Congress and fraud. We know about what happened in the 2000 election. It's been certified in Ohio that there was fraud in 2004. But now with Ron Paul, it is undoubted. He clearly won in Iowa. And a month after that election, they just threw the whole thing out and haven't said what they're going to do now, but admitted that a bunch of the precincts had their records disappear. Everywhere like Ames, where he was showing 55, 60% in the polls, all those college university areas. Then we saw the incredible fraud that took place in Nevada, where Ron Paul in most polls was #1, but came out #3. And then, of course, we saw what happened in Maine. There's many other examples, but in Maine, he was polling #1 in almost every poll, some polls #2. And then he came out, of course, losing in Maine, and now he's challenged it, and so they're having to go back and say, oh, we did say that Romney had won with only a few percentage points in, and a whole bunch of counties, the counties that were college areas and others that were polling the highest, they just didn't get counted that night. That's exactly what happened in Iowa, exactly what happened in Nevada. It's exactly what's happening all over this country. And finally, Ron Paul is challenging it. Listen, Stalin said, I don't care who votes, I care who counts the votes. We have a government that lied about WMDs, a government caught stealing and lying constantly. We'd be idiots to believe known liars who've been caught engaged in fraud. We've had Diebold programmers come out and say it's a scam. We've seen so much evidence of this. But the reason we got behind Ron Paul was so we could put out the message of liberty and freedom and ending the private Federal Reserve and stopping this empire that we pay for. So he's won by running, and he's winning by illustrating how much fraud there is. But let me get into more evidence of the fact that Ron Paul is really #1. First off, they told us he couldn't win. They told us he was going to lose. They told us that it would throw away our vote if we supported him, and he wasn't even in the running. And still, he won all the straw polls. Still, he got the most overall donations from small independent donors, showing true grassroots support. And despite that controlled corporate media mantra that he couldn't win, that worked 4 years ago, it failed, and he was still in that top tier. But here's the biggest piece of evidence of fraud. Not just the fact that he was given the least amount of time in the debates, 89 seconds of the CBS, so that when he does get coverage, it's incredibly negative. No, it's that consistently in the last year, he's gotten more money, even though we're 8 Republican candidates early on, and it still shows the numbers today with only 4 left. Ron Paul, in the last year, has gotten over 70% of all total donations from the military for all Republicans and Obama. And that's the big secret they don't want you to know about. Now, what does that illustrate? That where it's a straw poll, or where it's a scientific poll, or where it's flat out donations, he's winning in every indicator that they haven't been able to game or corrupt yet. They can only game their electronic voting machines, or in the case of Iowa or other areas, he even wins the precincts, but then they don't report them in and say the truck got lost. There were no trucks in Iowa. They vote right there, they post the results, call it in. But they said a bunch of trucks got lost everywhere he was winning by double digits. Same thing now happened in Maine. So he's winning. And that last piece of evidence, getting all those military donations, people like Adam Kokesh and other veterans had a march. Thousands and thousands showed up of active duty. Almost no corporate or media coverage. Again, showing they'll game things, showing they'll cover things up. In the debates, they attack him and say, you don't support the wars. You don't support the military, implying the military supports all these illegal wars, when in all the polls show they don't. Imagine if another candidate who was a warmonger had this type of military support. That's all you'd hear about. So it shows that the military is waking up. So are the police. They understand that criminals have taken over our government. And so it's a process. Even if Ron Paul doesn't win because of fraud, he is America's real president. And it shows that the ideas of sovereignty and anti-globalism and true freedom worldwide, 1776 worldwide is the answer. Now, I'm on the road traveling to Orlando to speak this next Sunday. I'll be doing reports for the nightly news. I'll be doing my radio show live from the road every day at 11 a.m. Central, 12 noon Eastern. But when I get back, I'm going to compile a huge report with all the evidence of fraud, with all the graphs and numbers to show this to you and break it down. But you've all seen it for yourself. But get the word out. We know that there's massive election fraud. We know the black boxes are kicking in. We know the scams are taking place. And our entire process of being a constitutional republic and the people being able to vote is in deep trouble. But look, Congress has a 9% approval rating for 2 years running now, lowest in history. And it's only going to get lower. Of course it's fraud. Most people are awake and angry, but still the corporate welfare, the wars, the corruption, the gun grabbing, the fast and furious, all of it, the socialist healthcare, it only gets worse regardless of what we do, because the fix is in many areas. They don't have these machines in everywhere. And where they don't, they just don't count the caucus votes. They've got their people in everywhere. And everywhere libertarians and constitutionalists try to run locally, the feds, minions are there trying to block them. But more and more they're failing in the case of Rand Paul and others. That's why you've got to run for local office. You've got to be a watchdog. You've got to take over the bureaucracy yourself so that more and more we can expose what they're doing. So look how far we've grown. Ron Paul 10 years ago couldn't get one co-sponsor to off the Fed. Passed the House last year, killed in the Senate. He's almost got the votes again this year. The idea is out. The liberty is there. That's why top globalist Brzezinski says the elite has never been in this much trouble. All right, I'm Alex Jones reporting for INFOWARS.com. Please get this video out to everybody, because knowing is half the battle. Being aware of what they're doing is half the battle, and getting out of our denial and saying no and waking up. Here's the evidence. You've seen it. Now the rest is up to you. Get out there and expose what's happening.
And of course, we all know why they would cheat Ron Paul out of the nomination, the constitutional congressman who they said is on a quixotic bid, who couldn't win. And even as he wins, they just keep turning the cameras away, ignoring him, looking to all other issues. It's because he deals with things like the Federal Reserve. And so what is up with the Federal Reserve lately as they approach the end of their 100-year charter, as somehow they're going to sell us on 100 more years of their pure tyranny? Well, the Fed is writing sweeping rules from behind closed doors. That is a headline in the Wall Street Journal, and they report that the Federal Reserve has operated almost entirely behind closed doors as it rewrites the rule book governing the U.S. financial system. They're calling it the most dramatic revision since the Great Depression, and it's been almost completely without public meetings. Since the Dodd-Frank financial overhaul became law in July 2010, the Fed has had 47 separate votes on financial regulation and scores more to come. And 45 of those 47 votes were totally behind closed doors. They secretly emailed in the votes later and even failed to report the few people within the Fed system who dissented on their decisions. That's the kind of things happening. They have so-called sunshine laws, but apparently that's just been interpreted as opening the window as they meet behind doors in the smoky room. Someone really had better shine a gigantic light on the Fed. Look what came out from the partial audit that they finally got after decades of hammering home this issue, after Ron Paul fought his entire career in Congress to try to bring this up to audit the Fed fully. They found that they were lending to all the familiar big banks. And so what are the decisions they're making behind closed doors in these 47 mostly secret meetings? Well, they're meeting on how much capital a bank must hold, what kind of trading banks can engage in, what kind of fees banks can charge on debit card transactions, all the kind of crazy stuff. And they've got a chart here on the Volcker Rule, which is a really dumbed down version under the Dodd-Frank bill, which was made to appear as though they're reining in the banks when really they're not. A dumbed-down version of Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall, of course, the rule that prevented banks that held just general, regular money from speculating and investing and going crazy on that derivatives market. The other set of meetings were all on derivatives. And who had the most meetings in both cases? It was J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, and Goldman Sachs, of course, up there as well, along with the other familiars, Barclays and Morgan Stanley. Why J.P. Morgan Chase at 16 meetings for the Volcker Rule? Why J.P. Morgan Chase at 14 meetings for the Volcker Rule? Well, you guessed it, because Jamie Dimon is the #1 person on the Federal Reserve Board of Directors, and he's the current CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, the Rockefeller and Rothschild-owned bank. That's right, J.P. Morgan was just a front man for the Rothschilds. The Rockefellers merged their Chase banking operations some years ago into that super mega bank, which has more than 90 trillion in derivatives, and that's a huge, huge issue. Of course, they're meeting on it. So Jamie Dimon is on the board of the Federal Reserve. We've got it right here. In fact, the board has 3 classes. He's a Class A member. Other vultures in that class of board of directors include Richard L. Carrion. No, I'm not making up the name. He's carrion eater, a little vulture. And then they have people represented to represent the public, elected and appointed to represent the public. People like the chairman of Macy's and other big institutions, Silver Lake, the big tech institution. So why was J.P. Morgan Chase at all these meetings? Because anytime Jamie Dimon shows up, he represents both of them. They meet in private. The Rothschilds and Rockefellers set up the Federal Reserve, and they have controlling shares in it, along with other big bankers. How disgusting is that? And how important is it that we bring true accountability to the Fed and move to shut it down? Just another reason to support Ron Paul, because no one else is even close on that issue. Not even close. Meanwhile, welcome. It's Wednesday, February 22nd, 2012. I'm Aaron Dykes, and we are in an aggressive but entirely nonviolent information war. They are taking over our Constitution behind closed doors to announce Romney, then later Santorum, as the victor, giving them a too close for statistical tie count, only a few votes apart somehow. And Ron Paul magically, forgettably, in third place, even though he had nearly as many votes as well. And most suspiciously of all, Nevada, a heavily libertarian state, a leave me alone and get out of my life state that Ron Paul did very well in and came in second place in 2008. Yet in 2012, Ron Paul got barely hijacking the fact that we are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights, and we better take it back. This fascism has been creeping and creeping and creeping for decades. That's gone. It's happening now. Everything is coming undone, and the fight is on right now for our rights on every front imaginable. Coming up on one of those fronts, we have Sheriff Richard Mack. He's been doing constitutional conventions with sheriffs to try to take back our states and local counties from all this federal encroachment. That's coming up. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss it. But first, the news. Ron Paul is being cheated out of the Republican nomination, and don't be surprised out there. You've seen all the fudging on the media where they forget to even put his name in polls, where he comes in first or second place in a straw poll and they don't even report. They report on the third or fourth place people. All these other shark teeth, phony rhino candidates have fallen out of the race, and they still prop up Romney and Gingrich and Santorum. It still doesn't stop Ron Paul, even as they've been cheating him in primary and caucus state after caucus state after caucus state. We've got a video in just a moment with Alex on the issue in depth. But of course, they've had to admit in Maine they didn't count on the votes. They accidentally reported that they weren't going to count the votes in certain counties that would have swung towards Ron Paul. And most significantly, they put off a heavily pro-Ron Paul county and district for over a week due to snow that never came. Also, they can announce Mitt Romney as the winner. It happened in Iowa, too. They admitted they didn't have a real vote count, but they just agreed. The Republican Party agreed behind